So at this point, we have built our meter web part in React. All of the previous functionality that we had has been pulled over. We have our properties, we have our visualization of our web part, and everything's working just great at this point. However, there are certainly a lot of ways we could improve this. And first and foremost, what we want to start looking at is the property pane on the right, which right now consists of some very basic text boxes to allow the content authors to input data regarding this web part's appearance. There are, in fact, a whole host of options that you can utilize to customize the property pane for each web part that you build. And this is a very important aspect of web part composition that you're definitely going to want to be familiar with as you start to build your own SharePoint Framework web parts. In order to do this, we're going to be working quite a bit in our webpart.ts file, and we're going to be adding some new properties to this panel to demonstrate other controls and other ways that we can start to interact with this particular type of web part. So let's start with the organization of our property pane to begin. And this is a good one to get started with because it's fairly easy to configure and change, and it's all about how you're composing the objects and arrays that exist down in this get property pane configuration method. This method, as you can see, is returning an object which contains an array of pages, and each page consists of a header object and a groups array. And then in turn, each group has a group name and an array of group fields. It's actually totally up to you how you want to organize this. You can have as many pages, as many groups, or as many group fields as you want, and you can change the composition of this object that's being returned by this method to totally change the way your property controls are configured and appear and are grouped in the property pane for your web part. As an example, we could take our title and description and keep those in one group, but anything that has to do with the meter itself, we can move to a different dedicated group. So I'm going to take the percentage property pane text field, and I'm actually going to cut that. And down here after this first group, which is right here, we'll add a second one. So we'll just add a new object. We'll give it a group name of chart settings. And then this group will have an array of group fields, which will contain, for now, just a single group field, which is our property pane text field for the percentage. You'll see as it refreshes over here on the right, we're now grouping our controls into two groups. We have our title and description field in the first group, and then we have the second group called chart settings that contains the percentage. This is a really quick and easy way to create some separation and some organization to your web part property controls. You will notice this group name is not actually appearing in our object anywhere. And the reason is that we are using this string localization feature where it's saying strings.basic group name. We certainly are going to cover localization of your web parts when we get into a later lesson. We're talking about deployment and maintenance and updates. But for now, and especially when I am actively working and developing a web part, I find that it's actually much easier to go ahead and hard code your strings into these panels, and then you can come back later once that set of strings has solidified and you're not constantly changing them, and it becomes much easier to just say, here's all my strings and here's how I'm going to localize those. And like I said, we'll talk a lot about that in a future lesson, but for now, let's just take out anywhere where it's using this strings thing, and we'll put in our own strings in that case. So for our group name on the first one, we'll put header settings. And our description will just have description as its label. And then in our header up here, we will put meter settings. And as we save that and go back in, you can see those strings have been updated in their respective places. And we also have this pages array, and you can have multiple pages in your property pane. So let's see what that looks like. Let's take this first page that we already have. Let's go ahead and duplicate that. And let's change the second one to page 2. And it will have let's just do a single group. So what I'll do for now is we'll just take our chart settings and we'll put that on the second page, and we'll delete that from this first page here. So we have our header settings on page 1, and then we have our chart settings on page 2. And as we save that, you'll see how this differs. When we go in to edit this web part, On the first page, you only get your header settings, title and description, and then way down at the bottom of the property pane, you have this one of two, and you get this back and this next button that allows you to navigate between pages. So I can click on next to get to the chart settings on page 2. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this because the first time I used it, I actually didn't even notice the back and the next buttons way down here at the bottom. It's not very prevalent, not very easily noticeable. I think there's a specific use case where this could be useful. And you may find that if you have a ton of controls, you may want to, for some reason, break it out into multiple pages. But even if you did have a ton of controls, this will actually scroll once you get to having quite a bit and it's too large to appear on the height of the screen. So even then, it's not really a lot of benefit. But you know it's there, you know it's available. If you decide that's something you'd like to do, feel free to go ahead. But for me, I'm going to go ahead and just undo that, and we'll go back to just using our two groups on a single page. So let's actually take a look in our React Dev Tools down here, because I do want to show you that our meter web part has this percentage prop, which is actually of type number, but in this case, percentage is actually being passed as a string. You'll notice the double quotes around that. And that is not an issue in this case because sometimes JavaScript just works and it does a good job knowing that you're trying to do a mathematical function on this, so it's probably a number, but it's not always 100% consistent, so generally this is a bad practice. And even though this works, it's probably best if we update this input field to actually give us a number value as opposed to a string. And thus far, we've only used text inputs for all of our property controls, but there's actually quite a few other controls available as well. So let's take a look at some of those, and we'll even create some new properties to test out the various options that are available. So first of all, over in our webpart.ts file, you'll notice each one of these controls corresponds to a property pane text field. And if we go all the way up to the top of our file to our imports, you'll see that that class is actually being imported from this Microsoft/SP webpart base package. And if I were to hit comma and type property pane here, you'll see in the autocomplete, there's actually a whole bunch of other stuff available in this package. And we'll start out with a couple really basic ones. So for example, there is property pane horizontal rule, as well as property pane label. These are actually not even associated with a control. So these are just kind of for organization and for adding text and rules to your property pane. So let's go ahead and add those first of all. And we'll do that by going down into our get property pane configuration method, and anywhere where we want a horizontal rule, for example, in between these two title and description text fields, we can just add property pane horizontal rule like that. And as we save that over on the right, you'll see there's a little divider right there. Label works a little bit differently. It's still pretty simple, but for example, down here, if we wanted an extra label for some reason, we could say enter a number between 0 and 100. We could say property pane label, and this does take a target property, which doesn't really matter in this case because we're not actually tying this to a property, so I'm just going to put in null. And then you have to pass in an object, and within that object there's a property called text that's actually going to contain the contents of this particular label. So I could say enter a value between 0 and 100. And you'll see once we save that, we're going to have a nice little label appear right there in our property pane. So those are very simple, very useful. You may reach for those at times to organize and place some content into your property pane, which is great. But most of the time, your property pane is going to consist of webpart property controls. So let's look at the other types other than just simple text field input and start to utilize those. I'll go up to the top of our file here, and let's also import property pane slider. And this is a really good one to use for a number input when you already know the range of your values, such as our percentage in this case. So we're going to change that one from property pane text field to use this new property pane slider. So down in our property pane configuration method, let's go ahead and replace this with property pane slider. And this does take a couple of extra inputs here. First of all, it's going to take a min value, which is going to be 0. It's going to take a max value of 100. And you should also probably specify a step value, which is how much it changes each time you nudge it a bit. In this case, I'll change it by 1% at a time. And whenever we save this, you will see that will change the control quite a bit. We'll go in and we'll edit, and we now get this nice slider where we can change the value just by moving it back and forth. And not only that, but in our React Dev Tools, because this is now a slider, it is a proper number value. So we're actually passing a number now down to our React components, which is ideal. So this all looks very cool. Let's add some new properties and play around with some of the other input types as well that you're going to interact with on a regular basis. So first of all, I want to add a checkbox, and that must be tied to a Boolean value. So in this case, let's create a Boolean that's going to allow the user or the author to turn this value that appears in the center of the donut chart on and off. So just as always, when we want to add a new web part property, we're going to add it in a few places. We're going to go to our web part props interface, and let's add show percentage value as a Boolean type value. And with that in our web part properties, let's also open up our manifest JSON file, and let's add a default value for that. So show percentage value will default to true, and we'll save our manifest file. And now we need to pass this down to our meter component. So we're going to have to edit its props. So iMeter props, let's open that up, and we'll have show percentage value of type Boolean. We'll add that to this interface. And then finally here we can say show percentage value is equal to this.properties.show percentage value. So that feels a little tedious. We added it to a lot of places and we're not even done yet. So just whenever you're adding a new property, it's better to do it in batches so you can do lots of them at once. We're going to have lots of practice in this video because we're going to play around with a lot of different web part properties. But usually this is something you could do, once or twice, or just when you need to make updates. That makes it a little bit more palatable. So before we can actually edit this, we will have to create a control for it because it's not appearing in our web part property pane. So let's go ahead and do that next. We will go to our import up here, and let's also import property pane checkbox. And we'll go down to our get property pane configuration method, and we'll add property pane checkbox, and it takes a target property, which is show percentage value, and it also takes some options such as the text you want to display. That's kind of like a label for an input. So this will be show percentage. And when we save that and we edit, you can see there is our nice checkbox. And now that that has been set in our React Dev Tools, we can take a look at our meter, and sure enough, it is being passed the value. As we turn that on and off, you can see it update over here. So unfortunately, this text right here actually exists in the donut component, which does not have that property available. So we'll have to create yet another prop to be able to pass this all the way down to the donut. And this is typical, this feeling of having to create web part properties and pass it down to multiple things. It's just something you're going to have to do in SharePoint Framework. And you're going to have to get used to that React one-way data flow where you have web part properties at the very top, and then you're passing that to your components, which pass it to child components, et cetera, et cetera. But let's go ahead and open up our donut props and add the show percentage value as a Boolean. And then in turn, in our meter, we're going to need to add show percentage value equals this.props.show percentage value. So we're passing this all over the place. And then finally, that is now available in React. We'll go to our meter and also in our donut, and you can see it now has that as a prop. show percentage value, and that is tied all the way up to the web part property at the very top of the tree, if you will. Okay, so now that that's available to our donut, let's open up the donut React component, and within here we'll just put basically a ternary operator around this text that's actually rendering that value. So we can say this.props.show percentage value, and if that's true, output text, otherwise output null. And we'll hit save there. And now, finally, when we edit, we can actually turn that on and off. Great. Mission accomplished. So anytime you're using a ternary operator, this is just a little tidbit, this doesn't really matter, but anytime you're using a ternary operator and you find your else condition is actually null, in React, there is a little bit of a shortcut. You can just say this.props.show percentage value and then do this. So that's more like an if then rather than if else. And when we save this, this does the exact same thing. You're just going to see that in React components that other people write, so I feel remiss if I didn't mention that. But you can see that's turning on and off, which is great. And let's add one more here while we're at it that you're going to use quite often on a regular basis, and that's going to be the property pane dropdown. Something you're going to use quite often when you have a predefined set of values that you can choose from. So in order to use that, we will once again need to create a web part prop. So let's go down to our interface here and let's create a dropdown that will allow you to choose the alignment of your title and paragraph text, either left, right, or center. So this will be header alignment is a string. And we need to add that to our manifest. So in here, we'll say header alignment will default to center. And we need to create the control for that. So let's go ahead and use this property pane dropdown, go down to our property pane configuration method, and we'll add this to the header settings because this has to do with a header. And down here below our description text field, we will add property pane dropdown. The target property will be header alignment, and then it accepts, as always, an object that contains a configuration for this dropdown. Now with dropdowns, you have a couple of things you need to specify, such as the label of the dropdown. So this can be header alignment. And we must also specify options, which if you look in the IntelliSense there, you'll actually notice that this is of type iPropertyPane dropdown option, and that's an array. So this is an array of that type of interface. And you can go look that up in the documentation for this control. This is all open source, so you can find lots of good documentation online for this. But basically what that means, it's an array of objects, and each object must contain a key as well as text. And that defines what appears in your drop-down menu. So for example, I can have left align like that, and then we'll also have center and right. We need a comma after these. Okay, so we built our drop-down here. When that refreshes, we can go over, hit edit, and you'll see sure enough there, header alignment, we now get a nice drop-down control that we can change. We're not doing anything with this yet, but you will see that that web part property control is now functional. So now that we have a web part property, let's pass it down to our child component, and that will allow us to actually change the alignment of our header. Let's go up to here where we are passing these props, and that is using the interface iMeter props. Let's open that up and add header alignment of type string as a prop, required prop for this component. And that way we can pass header alignment, this.properties.headerAlignment. And once that's done in our React Dev Tools over here, you'll notice that our meter component now has the header alignment, which is tied to this control right here. So you can actually see how it changes as we update it. So now in our meter.tsx file, we can actually put let's put a header element around the header. And on this header element, we're actually going to bind a style expression. And in React, whenever you want to bind a style and actually change the style, this is actually an object syntax where each key is the CSS declaration. So for example, if we want to do TextAlign, we're going to do TextAlign like that. And basically we can set the TextAlign on this header element to equal this.props.headerAlignment. And once we do that, that's not actually going to work yet because in our CSS file, we actually specified center for all H1s and paragraphs. So even if I change this, it's not going to do anything. But we can get that back to working by opening our SAS file. And let's just go ahead and take out the TextAlign on the H1 and the paragraph. And now hopefully that should inherit its parent value of left, center, and right. Great. And that's a pretty good tour of all the standard controls you're going to get in the SP Web Part base package within your SharePoint Framework web parts. There are a few other controls you may want to check out, and I definitely encourage you to take a look at those. But for the most part, they're going to follow that same pattern of importing the control and then placing it into your web part pane property object and then using its configuration options to change how that control behaves in the property pane itself in the browser. And the great news is you're not restricted to just those standard controls. In particular, there's a really great package called SPFx Property Controls created by the great folks over at SharePoint Patterns and Practices. And you can find a link to this down in the video description below. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow the installation instructions so you can see some of the controls that they also have available in this package. So I'll copy this command and we will switch back into the terminal. I'm going to hit Control-C to stop our local SharePoint workbench, and we're going to go ahead and paste that in to install this npm package. Now that that is installed, I will run gulp serve once again to start up our local workspace. And with that running, let's jump back into the web browser and let's just take a look at some of the controls they have available here. If you click on this controls link up here, you'll see all of the different options that you can have that you can very easily import into your own SharePoint Framework web part. And I'm not going to take a look at every single one of these, but some of the highlights are date time picker. This makes it super easy to capture date and time information in your SharePoint Framework web part. So if you do have a requirement for this sort of data, this is a great way to handle that. We also have a SharePoint list picker, so you can choose from all the lists in your current site, which is very helpful. You have a multi-select field, which I use quite often to be able to select multiple options. And this works almost exactly like the drop-down control that we used before. However, it does allow for multiple selection using the checkboxes that you see there. It has a simple number input, which can be handy. It has a people picker. And it also has one that we're going to use now, which is the color picker. So for each one of these, you just go to the documentation and it tells you exactly how to use it. For example, if we scroll down here, it shows you how to import this. So I'm going to copy this and we'll jump back into Visual Studio Code and we'll go ahead and paste that in to our webpart.ts file. And if you're a normal person, you're probably done, but I'm not normal. So I have to make sure that we have commas and indentation here. And you can see I've now imported both property field color picker as well as property field color picker style into this webpart.ts file. And the next step in the documentation talks about creating a webpart property for this particular control. And we know how to do that, so we can jump back into our webpart. And what I'd like to do is allow the color picker to change the fill color of our meter itself. So what we'll do is in our interface down here, we will create a prop called fill color of type string. We also need to provide a default value in our webpart manifest file. So let me open up our donut file because this is the default color I was using right here, the stroke, and there's that blue color that you see right now. And so we'll use this as our default color in the manifest.json file. And down here we will add a default value of fill color, which is going to equal that color. So with that in our webpart props interface as well as in our manifest file, we can go ahead and add our control for this color. Back in our web browser, you can see here is the actual code that you're going to need to place the color picker on the page. So let's go ahead and copy that, and we will jump back into code. And let's scroll down to our property pane configuration, and we will add a new control right underneath our show percentage value. And this is going to be property field color picker, which its target property is actually fill color. And then you'll see here it actually says selected color is this.properties.color. Well, that's also fill color there. And if we save that, you'll see over in our local workbench, if we were to edit this, we now have a color picker. So we can change the hue down here. You can change the actual color up top. It also has an alpha slider for semi-transparent colors. And then of course you have all the text inputs down here if you want to get really precise. So right now this is only a web part property. It's not actually being passed down to our React component. So let's go ahead and do that now. We will pass fill color down to all the way to the donut component that we have that actually is going to need that fill color. So just as before, we'll go through all of the trouble of passing that down through multiple components from the top level SharePoint web part. And that's going to involve, first of all, in our render method up here in webpart.ts, we have iMeterProps. So let's open that up and add fill color of type string. And we'll save that. And then we can pass fill color as this.properties.fillColor. And as you would expect over here, whenever we edit this and we open up our React developer tools, if we were to take a look at our meter, you'll see it has a fill color, which is tied now to this property control. So as you see, we update this to various colors. It's actually going to be updating the fill color on the meter component itself. Now we do need to pass this from the meter down to the donut, which is actually outputting the color in this case on the circle in the SVG. And obviously we have not passed that down yet, so that is not available as a prop. So that's going to be the next thing that we do. Let's open up iDonutProps first of all, and we're going to add a new prop to this, which is going to be fill color of type string. And then once we do that, we're going to have to go into our meter component where we're actually utilizing donut, and we now need to add this here, fill color equals this.props.fillColor. And with all of that troublesome passing props and data around and around in our SharePoint web part, you can see here, if we go down to our meter component and go to donut, you'll see sure enough it gets the color, and that color is now tied all the way up to the web part property itself, which is great. So now within our donut component, we can replace this stroke with an expression of this.props.fillColor. And as we save that, you'll see we are now able to go in and actually change the color of our fill, which is pretty cool. If you take a closer look at the color picker control itself, you do have a couple of options to tweak the way this appears. Personally, I think this is a bit overwhelming with all of these controls it adds. It's really individually, it is like 7 or 8 different controls that it adds to your property pane. And I like to kind of collapse that down and hide it so that it's only needed whenever the user actually decides they want to pick a color. And there is an easy way to do that with this control. And if we switch over to meterwebpart.ts, if you remember at the very top, not only did we import property field color picker, but we also imported property field color picker style. And that is what allows us to control the style of our color picker. So if we go down to the instance where we're actually using that here at the bottom, property field color picker, you'll notice that it is setting this style property, and down here it's saying style.full. Well, if we just change that to style.inline, that will update our control. And when we edit this, you'll see now it's much more compact. So we see our color there. If we want to pick it, we can click on this icon over on the right. It expands out. We can now pick a new color if we like. And we can click on the icon again to collapse it, which is very nice. We also may decide that we don't want the user to be able to adjust the alpha. That's just something that's extra that they really don't need to be able to do in this case. So we can come over here in our code, and this property alpha slider hidden is set to false. We can just set that to true. And when that refreshes, obviously the alpha slider will now disappear, which simplifies this just a bit. So at this point, we are going to call the meter web part 100% done. I think this is a pretty good example of a typical web part you may build. Although it is quite simple in its execution, it really helps demonstrate a lot of the most basic features of the SharePoint framework. In our next lesson, we are going to start from scratch and create an entirely new web part that does something quite different.